all, welcome in. Thank you so much for coming. This is the American Democracy Project's Times Talks. This one is being presented by the amazing Dr. Nuchelle Chance of the Psychology Department. We would like to thank all of you for coming, and I'm just about to hand it off to her. I know we are like super down on food back there. We're gonna have more food in like about 10 minutes, so if you didn't get a chance to grab anything, I think we'll have more food in a little bit, so be sure to grab something. And then at the end of this time talk, we will be giving away a free tote bag, so make sure you stay till the end. And I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. I mean, it's better than food and free swag to motivate people to come out, right, on a rainy Wednesday. I thank you so much all for coming. I'm actually quite humbled to see so many people here at this time, so I hope you come to be supportive. I mean, if you heckle, that's fine. Please know I heckle back. As you said, I'm Dr. Chance, and I'm an assistant professor in psychology here in the Department of Psychology, College of Health and Behavioral Sciences. I've been associated with the university in various roles since 2015, virtual space, full-time faculty in 2018. Took a brief sabbatical after I finished my PhD. Worked in Missouri for about 2 years, and then something just like, come on back. So here I am, doing what I love to do, see a lot of familiar faces, colleagues, students, current students. Thank you so much. Are you having a hard time hearing me? I'm going to try to speak up, and I might walk out. This pressure change has really got me messed up, my head, my nose, so I'm going to try to project as fast as I can. If in the back I start to get a little low, flag me or something so I can try to up my voice. And I had 2 classes this morning. That's usually my max for today. I'm peopled out, but here I am for you all. You're welcome. Again, thank you so much for coming. This right here is a very brief synopsis based on one of my major pieces of work that I put together. And it took me quite a while to get to the outcome of this. So a lot of academics, oh my God, we did it. Publish or perish. Oh, it's very real, y'all. It's very real. Nonetheless, I've been able to take and pull different pieces of it and really target in on it. And obviously based on the timeliness, socially, politically, chronologically, whatever, it is super relevant, super timely, and thus here we are. So I really wanted to approach it from a point of inclusion, and to really talk about the factors that motivate human behavior regarding topics such as this. So we'll look at these ideological divides. But humor me for a few minutes. If you got a mobile device, scan this and take a few minutes and answer a few of the questions on my brief survey here. And you may giggle when you see some of the questions. And you may giggle when you see some of the questions as they just may seem so, benign, right? Like, what could you do with these questions? What do you get from these questions? Side note, did anybody actually take the original survey that started rolling around in 2020? Thank you very much. Is this better? Might not have to straighten as much. And again, you're not being tested or anything like that. This is simply to make an assessment, to provide a little bit of foundational grounding on what it is that I've done and how that connects to this. Has everyone been able to scan that plan on screen? Excellent, excellent. So, I liken myself somewhat an unofficial member of the BAU. Me and Dr. Reed are going to get married someday, in my head. Nonetheless, I do like to identify someone as a profiler. I'm no forensic psychologist, but I do feel like I'm pretty good at assessing human behavior. Sussing out, questionable things, as my teenage son would like to say. Oh, that's suspect. It's okay. Nonetheless, we as social psychologists, we ask questions regarding human behavior, likes, dislikes, preferences, all of this to be able to draw inferences on cognitions, affects, behaviors. What we think, what we feel, thus how we behave. Which brings us to this topic. Is anybody confused by the line of questioning that you just witnessed? Like, what can those questions have to do with anything? Can I draw any implications or and form any conclusions on a person, can I profile them based on that alignment of questions? Any thoughts? Feel free to engage. Yes.
I feel like you can't define them as a complete person, but like you can understand their skills, attributes, like mainly by their personality type. I feel like these have like a little bit of reflection on like what they would choose in certain situations.
Okay. Okay.
I feel like habits.
Habits. Okay.
Yeah, like if they like cook at home like 6 nights a week rather than like eat out one, like that might be like a habit of theirs, or like the ice cream one, like oh they always go get chocolate, whatever.
Any other thoughts that I might draw?
Might indicate socioeconomic status if you stay at home and make all your meals as opposed to going out. If you went out a lot, it might indicate more expendable income.
Absolutely. So all of these responses go thematically alluding to that I can draw conclusions based on this correlation between the responses here. I might not tell you the whole picture about a person, but I can maybe organize you an amazing date night based on the responses. Yeah, we can do that. We can plan a great trip based on your responses to these things. And just out of curiosity, let's take a look real fast at how we respond to some of these things. Okay, so it looks like we have a great majority of people that prefer to cook at home. What's funny is it might not even be cheaper to cook at home because of grocery prices. I mean, really. A lot of people prefer the mountains. I'm not surprised. As a North Carolinian and the East Coaster, obviously I prefer beach. But I've noticed in the Midwest that people prefer the mountains here because that's what you have. With the ocean, y'all, salt life. It's amazing. Get you some. Then we have a lot of preference for sweet. Interesting, more introverts in the room. People prefer movies over books. Not at all shocking. Okay, yes, here we go, Marvel fans, DC fans. Show yourselves to the door. I'm playing, no, you don't have to play. Actually, dressed up as Poison Ivy for Halloween. See, I'm equal opportunist. And we have the majority of vanilla ice cream. Interesting, right? So I can play some stuff. I can put a nice little dinner together. But again, that's not going to tell me the whole picture. And if you're curious about where these questions come from, these are actually some of the items on the collective scale that I use to tell the story that is published in this article. But all that to say, again, really driving that correlation will not infer causation. We might can inch up to causation. We can dance around it, but I'm not comfortable enough to say that this particular choice preference leads to this thing definitively, okay? So keep that in mind as we go through this information. Now, as I say in the beginning, I want to be very clear as far as the disclosure. It's at the very bottom of my screen. But the views held here by me are meaning mine personally. They do not necessarily reflect the department that I work for, the university, or the college itself that I work for. So again, these views that drive me, these positions that I've taken, they are mine and mine alone. All right, so let's take a look at this clip. Now, everyone here looks old enough that they probably recall what it was like living through the pandemic, right? What were some of the downfalls of the pandemic? Can you really remind me what they experienced socially? Say it again?
Sorry, I immediately thought of toilet paper.
Yes, buying up all the toilet paper, right? Yes, that was a thing, and it continues to be a thing for whatever the case is.
All online classes.
Had to convert to online, right? So we had to social distance.
Sports got shut down.
Yeah, we lost a lot of our entertainment. Man, it was tragic. Anything else that really was prevalent? Masking. Oh yeah. Some people were like, okay, I want to exist in this space. I don't want to get sick. Let's wear the mask. Let's play by the rules. Let's vaccinate. Let's do other things. But obviously, everybody does not necessarily feel that way. So this particular clip is going to be a short clip. I'm just going to play for about a minute. But this is some of the triggering behavior that was captured on camera during the height of the pandemic.
Sunday afternoon at a Starbucks in San Diego, 19-year-old barista Alex Beckham says the customer in blue pulled down her Trump 2020 mask to ask a question. Beckham says she asked the customer to put the mask back on, which she did before becoming agitated and taking it off again. That's when another customer says he started recording.
Told her that just to make sure that when she comes, if she ever were to come back, to make sure that the store and the customers were protected.
Moments later, the customer serves up a different motive.
You're discriminating against me because I'm a Trump supporter.
If she felt discriminated against because she was a Trump supporter, that's on her. That's not my fault. I never brought any mention of her politics.
Moments later, the customer becomes more upset.
No, it's not a law. It's not a law. And I can show you the field code and everything. It's a hoax. I don't have to wear a mask. I'm not going to wear a mask. This is America. I don't have to do what you say. If you're Trump 2020, you need to leave. Thank you. No. Thank you. Have a good one.
The customer isn't quite done yet.
So it goes on for a little bit longer, as you see on the red line. It's not done. It goes on, and this is just one of many clips that surfaced during this time. Curious if anyone thinks like me, are any questions brewing about this particular interaction in human behavior here? Is anything very perplexing about this? What was your thought?
Just that I feel like it came completely out of nowhere. There are rules and regulations that the general public does have to abide by, and I feel like she already had the mask on, and then it just became a huge problem after a simple comment was made.
Absolutely. So for me, sorry, did you have
Just the disconnect between like partisan politics and health policy, like they don't necessarily go together. You know, having somebody wear a mask is not necessarily an indication of presidential candidate preference or party preference or party ideology.
And that's exactly what my question is. What does one have to do with the other? If you didn't have a Trump shirt on, I wouldn't just imply that necessarily. So why are you making these leaping, conclusions, drawing these very bizarre connections between things that ideally really don't necessarily connect? Mm-hmm.
Well, I do think you can find some ideological thread that is speaking of. But you have individuals who, although not strictly libertarian in their positions, might say, well, I believe in the freedom of individuals, and I don't really want a government telling me how to act, and thus I don't want to wear a mask, even if it is, you say, a public. That's for them not just public health issue. It is a reaction to it. It is a governmental decision, and that's where you can get a political connection to what seems like something that would be disparate, but it isn't for them.
So what he's alluding to here for some of the language that might be a little bit morbid is the emotional component that is triggered in people. It doesn't have to necessarily be rooted in logic. When you start to assess people's emotions and tamper with how they feel, even if there was a mask in the first place, whatever happened, flip the switch, and at some point, now I have to integrate these other factors, which for me feel connected somehow, right? You might be stepping on something. So there is some sort of, they said, ideological connections here, even though it might not feel practical or logical for the average person or other person. And so I started seeing all these videos keep coming out, and I'm just continuing to ask, what is the point? What is the connection? Why are we seeing these attacks in areas that don't necessarily connect with each other? So I started thinking, okay, what other connected ideologies might have similar reactions, and how can they link together? For instance, beyond just wearing the mask in a public space and somehow that linking to your political choice and preference and candidacy. More recently, we're seeing some high-end aggression in political actions. For instance, there's been an increased uptick of vandalism and theft of yard signs. And even more so now, we're seeing the destruction of federal property, such as ballot boxes and locations where people will be going to vote, which is a major grievance as far as federal property goes. But it speaks to something, I think, bigger at a humanistic level, at least for me as a social psychologist who is concerned about the humanistic component of people, as well as these erroneous connections between things that ideally shouldn't be connected but are connected together, right? And so we'll kind of get into how these political acts of aggression can essentially start to develop and evolve into what we're now referring to as political terrorism in some instances. Now, back to the research itself. Obviously, I'm driven very much by psychological goals and research, and we understand clearly about things like social ideologies and political ideologies, all the civil unrest that's been associated with the pandemic, the election in 2020, increased racial justice movements at the time, and how that's kind of been ongoing. With this said, I wanted to look at the examination between people's views and the factors that influence them to basically be able to understand and possibly predict associated human behavior. Again, I'm rooted in social psychological concepts, humanistic concepts. This obviously teeters over into some sociology as well. And all those political connections, it's not heavily in the political science, just for clarity there. Now, again, we talked somewhat about some of the drivers, the motivation, some of the behaviors that we've seen regarding some of that behavior. And what the research and the literature tells us is it could be rooted in things like people's values, their ethics, their morals, and their ideologies. So when we talk about values, again, without going to textbook definition, we're talking about these shared concepts that are learned from people and how they're passed down. They regulate how we view society and thus how we interact in society, right? We have these social norms, we have unspoken rules of how we govern ourselves and behave. There are laws, very clear written rules of how we should behave. We know what's good, what's right, what's wrong, what's evil, all of these types of things. And so these are the basis for how we are going to view our opinions on different topics and how issues might develop. Connected with our values, obviously, are our opinions and our views, and these shape our values essentially. And these can shift based on information that we're exposed to. They're the life component of an attitude, is what we would say in social psychology. And so we're talking about these self-referential views, declarations about how we feel about a situation or a phenomenon. The phenomenons can be policies or regulations or just whatever you like to eat in the cafeteria some days. Ideology is a higher view of these things, and they start to tie in together. So as they become more concrete, they become more solid. We refer to the ideologies, and it could be our beliefs about persons, groups, particular phenomena. They're not always necessarily based on knowledge or on sound research, because again, there can be a very strong emotional appeal when it comes to these. But they're how we make sense. They're rooted in schemas, which are these concepts, these frameworks that help us navigate the environment and the world, how we think, thus how we behave. And as I said, for me, it's taking these two approaches, these two areas within psychology, and really integrating them as how we understand human behavior, because it's obviously heavily rooted in the fact that how people interact, think about each other, feel about each other, thus behave toward each other, but not taking out the fact that we're still driven by the understanding of humanity, how we feel about people, about things, and how this can impact situational roles. So as we talk about this, it's obviously rooted in the idea of ideological divides, and that's social divides, that's political divides, and it reflects in different ways. It can't just be the ideological polarization, which is rooted in those political-based beliefs, differences on things that are probably put in place, written documentation, legislation, whatever the case is. But then there's that effective component, which is that emotional side we're talking about. Doesn't really matter what's written, because if how I feel is bigger to me, then that's going to trump whatever's documented, right? I hear nothing about your policy or law. It doesn't make me feel good. What about my freedoms, my rights, my autonomy? And all of that can actually overshadow social good in some instances. It can actually project social harm. And there's obviously quite a bit of negative outcomes that can come from the social and ideological division, such as social fragmentation between individuals and groups of people and organizations and all sorts of things. We can find ourselves in political gridlocks, I feel like we had so many government shutdowns at one point in time. It was like, the federal government shutting down. Like, why? And I have so many people that are military as far as family that were having to wait for checks and stuff just to live because the federal government was shutting down. Increased tension at the micro level, the macro level, the meso level. We find tension amongst ourselves and it grows. And then, of course, there's an erosion in trust in others, in governmental figures, and the government itself, and that can radiate, and we're seeing evidence of that as well. So again, I was asking about connecting factors, and you all took the survey and seen the question. So I was curious in, of course, political ideologies. That was one of the major ones, especially in 2020, and still today. We also have a very clear understanding of the social ideologies, and a lot of times those play hand in hand directly with political ideologies, but more on that effective component and less of the legislative stuff. But because there are so many topics that were hot button topics, I really felt the need to break them out into individual components. So I created these new categories of ideologies: health and medical, safety, security, and legal. And so what happened with these is the fact that we can actually take safety, security, legal, health, and medical and chunk them under political and social, and a lot of times we do. But for the purpose of the research and to not cause complexity in the analysis, it was important for me to be able to pull these sub-factors out and be able to assess them as to what they particularly were associated with. And so when I talk about these different ones, I'll just give you kind of an overview. So when we talk about the political ideologies, I was talking about the role and function of government, which would be for the role and job of government, which is to basically protect people and provide proper order. Textbook definitions there. These can be broad in scope, but they can include different identifiers, such as a identification of political representationists, whether it's Democrat, Republican, Independent, progressive, liberal, conservative. All of these fall under the political ideologies. They can also be broader if we take a look out beyond our Western standpoint. Beyond a Western standpoint, if we think of things like democracies versus monarchies, communism, all of these also allude to the different types of political ideologies. But again, keeping it very Western-centered, obviously we're focusing on the dichotomy that exists within the states. As far as social ideologies, these are the topics that define social life. They exist at the intersection of the social interaction and heavily into that cultural component. And of course, there's overlap. And they can surround a lot of different topics, such as race-based ideologies, whether that's racism, bigotry, supremacy, gender-based ones, such as feminism, individualism, collectivism, religion, work ethics, matriarchy versus patriarchy, and so on. For me, under the idea of social ideologies, I chose to investigate the ideological framework on humanity. Specifically at the time where the topic of Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter. And this was a very, very contentious position where most people didn't exist in multiple categories. They were heavily independent of each other, heavily are independent of each other still, according to the literature. And then the health and medical ideologies. And so again, as a subunit of the social and political, which shouldn't necessarily be, but is, this is classifying unique categories such as views on health, medical topics, healthcare access, euthanasia, women's reproductive rights, and so on. So again, social, political, but still health particularly. And then the ones on safety and security were focused on categories like issues emerging directly associated with political governments. For instance, relationship between participants' views on things like Second Amendment rights, legal sentencing, drug laws, immigration laws, orientation, LGBTQI orientation. And so all of these components for me weren't clearly applicable under social and political, so that's why I had to create these. Side note, I really had to clear a lot of reviewers and publishers to get that, because they're like, they don't fit there, and I'm like, yes they do. And I fought it, and it worked. So as as any good researcher, we're going to be guided by a research question. And so again, overarchingly, I was asking, how do these ideologies align, and is there a pattern between individuals and groups? And so this is heavily based off the literature. I predicted ideally that groups that were identifying as conservative would hold more rigid and oppressive ideologies, while liberals would hold flexible and equitable ideologies. I further anticipated participants with specific views in one ideological category would carry those similar views across into other ideological categories. So, again, not my own theoretical foundation, but I definitely wanted to support this because I knew the contentious nature that this research was implying. And so I was like, let me go find some people that are way smarter than me and cite them, because it's necessary to do that. So, without putting the cart before the horse, these are the theoretical foundations that I used to argue these claims here. The first one is the moral foundations theory, and that was developed by Graham and their colleagues. And so with this particular theory, it's suspected that the ideological divides are based somewhat on political identity and somewhat on morals and values, which makes sense based on the title of it, right? This one heavily exists in the political sciences and also in the social psychology and those type of sciences. I also use the ideological conflict hypothesis, and this suggests that liberals and conservatives would be equally intolerant towards groups with different values, essentially their outgroup. And that includes their beliefs, their own values, and that they will intentionally use various strategies to maintain their own worldview, their order. And that includes things like motivated information processing and worldview defenses against the outgroup. So it allude to emotional discreditation of what those other outgroup members think, believe, feel. And then the third one, which is just a follow-up to the other two, and it actually came after the results, interestingly enough, was the rigidity of the right hypothesis. And again, the last two are hypotheses outside of theories. And if you're not taking a research methods class, you'll understand that hypotheses, after they've been validated enough, they can become theories, but they're not there yet. So rigidity of right, as the name implies, is that there are psychological components to right-wing ideologies, and those are related to things like seeking security and certainty and imposed safety regulations. So how did I do this research? Well, just like you all answer some questions, I just asked people to answer a bunch of questions for me. But I had to make it really fun because I knew how contentious some of these topics were. And if people just seen a bunch of questions and I asked them to tell me, how do you feel about women's abortion rights? And how do you feel about gun laws? Or people might shock up, right? I'm going to answer this. This is sketchy. So I completed correlational research design using an online survey, use Google Forms. And this allowed me to be able to deliver the survey, analyze it, and I use correlational chi-square to analyze, as well as log linear analysis. Don't get lost in the mix. Some people know exactly what that is. Otherwise, again, it's just correlational research, drawing connections between variables. And so I really wanted to look at the relationship between these variables and amongst the categories of variables themselves. And so participants were recruited to complete the survey, and I disguised it as that this or that game. You all remember playing this or that growing up? Someone gives you a choice and you got to pick best of two or best of three, and you have to pick an answer. So that was the route I was going. So we call that gamification in some settings. Shout out to Tilt, because when I worked in Tilt, that was really a big factor that Andrew was pushing. He was my boss at the time. And so I was like, if we can do that in teaching and pedagogy and professional development, I could surely do it in research too. Limit the intensity of what really is happening here, right? And once we limit the intensity, people put their guards down. Therefore, as a researcher, I'm probably getting more authentic results, which is really what we shoot for. So again, the Google Forms were 100% anonymous. People did not have to answer the questions. They could have skipped them. But they were answering the questions in that would you rather format, picking between those two hypothetical scenarios, just like you all did. So here is the actual questions. Now, those questions you all answered, those 7, I pulled them right out of here. And so, as I said, those were the fun questions, right? Those were questions that I included just to lighten the load of what the actual research was. However, I had 17 critical factors that are mixed into that. As you see, they're very small, so I'll just read a few. But everything indicated with a star is one of those 17 critical factors that falls under one of those 4 categories. So they included things like a person's race, their sexual orientation, ideology, preference, and these 2 columns are the 2 choices. So again, ideology between Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, position on Blue Lives Matter, whether it's being supported as a valid position versus it not being a valid argument, things like political association, whether you lean towards conservative or liberal, rules on COVID-19 masking, mask on, mask off, in the future. Vaccine controversy, anti-vaxxers versus vaccinations, breastfeeding in public, covered versus just feeding, drug laws regarding the legalization of marijuana versus the maintaining federal illegality, immigration, supporting or opposing border walls. So obviously, again, I'm asking, if those 2 things connected in the coffee shop, asking you to wear your mask and your views on Trump, then what else connects, right? So I started connecting the dots. And I said, well, if you feel that way about this thing, I will predict that you feel this way about this factor, and this way about this factor, this way about this factor. Not causationally, just correlationally. And what you think happened? Think they started to align? So give a little background on the people. Listen, I haven't read an article that had a survey number this big in so long. But it had 1,746 participants. That is a lot. And I think it was just because of the contentious nature of this actual research. People started talking about it when I put the link in social media sites and Reddit and Discord and Facebook and LinkedIn. People that took it, they took it. But then there was people that were in opposition to it. Like, how could you even get this IRB approved? Did you see this survey that she shared? A moderator, group moderator, how did this even get passed? So they tagged it, they're calling hostility, which is nothing gonna do nothing but push up the views on it. So thank you, haters, because without the haters, I would not have such a large, ample sample size. Yeah, I just can't say enough about that. So sometimes it's really beneficial to have controversy and sex appeal in your research if you want to get those. Again, I'm a research methods teacher, so I push all those factors. Just kind of an idea breakdown. The majority of my participants were employed. It was almost an equal split between relationship status. But again, limitations in the fact that obviously algorithms are feeding people to me that are going to be like me, right? So the majority of my participants were liberal. I also found that based on some follow-up research I'm doing is that the people that started to feel attacked by the questions in the survey that more so aligned with being conservative, they stopped partway through once they started, I guess, to connect the questions and seeing where it was going. And Lord would know they didn't want me to draw any conclusions based on their potential views, so they literally emailed me and told me, I'm not completing your survey. And I was like, okay, thank you for starting. So again, a much lower number of conservative view people than liberal. Breakdowns of education, location within the world, again, majority in the States, small percentage outside of the States, some didn't disclose. Had a quite a good number of participants that were students, but again, a more majority not. I think that's alluded to the fact that I used social media resources during the pandemic where we were still socially isolating. Sexual orientation, and of course it's no shock that the majority of participants were white because we see white women and Westerners are like heavily participating in research for the most part. So that just kind of painted a picture of who the people were that completed the survey. Now as far as results go, their alignment was definitely there. So again, asking specific research questions. For instance, is political identity associated with the other factors? As I said, I was curious about the connection between the individual items, but I was also curious about the connection between those 4 factors and do they actually lean into each other? So I looked at political identity by the other 16 critical factors, and of course we found a lot of alignment there. Again, don't worry about the stat stuff, but all these areas where you see less than 0.05 means there's significant alignment between those views. And I had a 0.001, I think, on every single one of them, which is great. As statisticians, we love to see that. So I looked at those relationships and based on political identity, and we were able to significantly associate it with all the factors, the critical factors, in those 4 ideological categories. And again, they're broken down by their groups here, just see safety, security, health and medical, political, and social. Based on the data, we do know that political identity is significantly associated with all the other factors and is supported by the literature, as we talked about with the theories that were mentioned. So when assessing the frequencies by the categories, obviously my hypothesis was supported here, and all variables based on identity with slight variation on some levels were aligned as anticipated, where liberals would hold the more flexible ideals, the equitable ideals, where conservatives were identifying as holding the more rigid perspective on those ideals. And again, this is supported by the moral foundations theory. And when looking at the political ideology category, political ID by presidency, obviously it was very clear in alignment there. And one of the ones that was very interesting was BLM, vaccinations, free universal health care, more gun control and opposition. Again, the literature says that these are the more equitable, flexible positions on those. Whereas the conservative views are identified as all lives matter, blue lives matter, pro-life, less gun control, supporting the border wall. Once I found this alignment with political views, I kind of anticipated the connections between the rest of them. So of course, social ideology is going to lead to similar findings here. Again, the 2 factors used to assess this was the Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, and the support or lack thereof for the Blue Lives Matter factor. So again, asking specifically about the relationship between those variables, it was predicted that with the alignment of the views for those, so participants supporting BLM also find that Blue Lives Matter would be an invalid position to take. And likewise, those supporting All Lives Matter support the stance that Blue Lives Matter. Because of the connection between the 2, I wanted to overlap them as well, because again, the literature says that these 2 overlap heavily with each other. So not just enough importance to evaluate them independently, but to look at them in connection. So is there a relationship, and does the person's views on things like BLM, ALM, Blue Lives correlate to their political identity? And again, there is a significant relationship here between the 3 factors as they emerge. The majority of the participants that supported Black Lives Matter also feel Blue Lives Matter was invalid, while those staying behind All Lives Matter support the positionality of Blue Lives Matter. And so if you were wondering why the 2020 U.S. presidential preference was not included in this particular analysis, it actually didn't fit statistically into my hierarchical log linear analysis. Nonetheless, a lower scale analysis, chi-square, did reveal participants' presidential preference is still significantly associated with their ideologies on Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. Obviously, so this held the views that All Lives Matter were those that were conservative, felt the view that Black Lives Matter. 12.9% there. So those were the ones that were obviously very clear. But the other ones, I was like, okay, what is the story going to tell when we look at these health and medical and safety security? So again, there were 5 factors within this particular category: mass preference, vaccinations, health care, abortion, and breastfeeding. And again, I use outside raters, other scholars, researchers, to help me confirm that these categories fit well into this category. That's also a step you have to take in research when you're getting peer reviews, is that I didn't just do it here because I think it sounds good. I use evidence from the literature, I use other scholars as sound sources to support these claims, because we have to do that. So again, asking about the relationship here between their views on things like mass preference, vaccinations, and all these. Are they connected? That's what all these errors are basically asking. Are they connected? So So what we found here is that, again, I used statistical analysis on these ones to indicate that the model was actually not a fit with all 5 factors. And what that means is one of these did not fit well with the others. They didn't align as good. The correlation wasn't as strong. So the first statistical analysis led me to pull one out, and so the output from that indicated a 3-way analysis that led to a strong interaction. And that was specifically between factors of mass preference, abortion, and healthcare. And those were predictors of the data to each other. The other 2 were not strong enough to lead in that analysis. So a significant proportion of participants who wore masks were also more likely to be pro-choice and support free universal health care. Likewise, those who refused to wear masks were more likely to be pro-life and support private health care. And since vaccination and breastfeeding factors did not fit into the 5-way model, I just used chi-square to look at those independently as far as with their connection with the other variables. And of course, those chi-square analysis did reveal that they were still connected with the other ones, just not in the full predictor model there. So the 2-way relationships existed, but the 3-way was the stronger for the other 3. And then the 4th category was about the safety, security, and legal ideologies. And this one also included the 5 factors, Second Amendment rights, legal sentencing, drug laws, immigration, and LGBTQIA plus orientation. This one was one I had to do a lot of background work on too. So again, with this one, my 5-way model did not show significance. And again, all 5 factors weren't strongly correlated together in a predictive order. So again, ran another analysis to look at them and to determine the connection there, as the 5-way didn't come out true, but the model fits better when I removed the Second Amendment factor, interesting enough. And so doing some background research and talking to people, a lot of people just like guns. They didn't feel like the government should be taking guns. So it's pulled out of this particular analysis. And so looking at a 4-way log linear analysis, I looked at the associations for legal sentencing, drug laws, immigration, and LGBTQIA orientation. And that one did have significant results in predictive stance. Now, as far as the breakdown here, the largest proportion of participants support life without parole, the legalization of marijuana, they oppose the border wall, and believe the LGBTQIA plus orientation is predetermined as opposed to being a choice, right? However, legalization of marijuana was not included in this either. And I found a lot of interesting literature after finding these results because it was a point of contention, interestingly enough, between participants. Overall, out of my whole entire sample, 85.9% of the participants supported legalization of marijuana. That means no difference really between political views, which means everybody wants to smoke it sounds like. Alternatively, if a significant proportion of participants did support things like the death penalty, then they support the border wall and believe the LGBTQI orientation was a choice as opposed to being predetermined. And so again, as with the other variables, I did the chi-square analysis to look at those independent relationships, and those were all significant, like the 0.001 value. But what does all that mean, right? A lot of connections, a lot of variables. What is the purpose? Why do we even care about people's views on these different things? Well, to focus on the fact that there was such unrest, uptick in social culture, or political division, and that could be due to things like CDC regulations, the pandemic, positionality on views of humanity, like all lives matter versus blue lives matter, presidential preferences, and so on. It's been quite high. It was quite high. It's still quite high. So I looked at this relationship to identify values, identity characteristics of the holders, right? Because as a social psychologist, as a humanist, I care about the holders because those are the people I interact with on a daily basis, right? Those are people that are our neighbors and our classmates and our instructors. And why do we care about their particular views? Well, because their implicit or explicit views could have a direct or indirect effect on me as a person, right? So guided by those theories, I looked at the overlap and where there could potentially be harm as far as the discussion goes. And used it to really frame this, finding a lot of robust evidence. There is the idea of connection between human behaviors. Again, all of those were able to heavily support the results. With the more foundation theory, it's particularly saying that there are several innate or natural universal availabilities of people, and that can be supported by our environment. We have psychological systems that are the foundations of our intuitive ethics, and those become really prevalent when people deviate from what they were taught growing up. And for instance, children start to deviate from their parents and their grandparents' views. They start to go their own way because their view just didn't feel right to me, right? I have to take a stance. There was a lot of videos of that rising in 2020 as well, where children were recording themselves, either very obviously or even like hidden camera style, of them taking stances, vocal, verbal, physical stances against maybe the oppressive views that they felt like their parents and aunts and uncles and grandparents had. But the ideological conflict one, that one pretty much predicts the partisan groups will be similarly intolerant against any social group that's the other, the out group, where their beliefs were inconsistent with your own beliefs. And because of this theory, it's predicted to engage in a variety of strategies to maintain your security in that view. And so if people will potentially take conflict and behavioral actions to maintain your worldview, what does that look like? If you feel violated because of someone doesn't hold the same political view as you, or moral, religious, spiritual, whatever it is, how do you handle that? You shrug your shoulders, or do you cuss them out, right? Do you steal their girl sign because you don't like that candidate? You light it on fire? What do you do? So if people feel challenged about their ideologies, they'll behave in a certain way. And if our minds are made up, it can be next to impossible to change those views, especially when you are emotionally connected to something. So some of these strategies can include using resistance through things like protest, counter-protest, debating, riots, and even coups on the U.S. Capitol. You know, right? Lastly, the rigidity of the right hypothesis states that cognitive, motivational, and ideological rigidity resonates more strongly with political conservatism. And these characteristics have been regarded as conservative, involving free market economics, no limit to economic redistribution. Again, a lot of economic components there. Money. Tolerance, traditional sexual morality, traditional cultural preferences in conjunction with opposition to other cultural things. And all of this is indicated by the data, where conservatives significantly hold these moral views more strongly. And so as far as values go, again, values influence behaviors, and our values are like roots, right? Think of a tree. You're rooted to something, you're rooted to the ground. The values are what root you to society, who you are. And these values are firm, they're foundations, they influence our thoughts, our decisions, our behaviors. Our character traits would be synonymous to that of a tree trunk. You can see it, right? It's hard. It's something that you can knock on, birds live in it, all that good stuff. Our behaviors, on the other hand, are the things that come out of us, like those branches and leaves that really extend from the tree. They have far more access. They move regarding. The trunk doesn't move, right? But the branches are theoretically moving. They're growing. They're usually moving towards sun, water, sources like that. But those are the difference between the structures. And again, our behaviors, as I said, those are what is the most visible part, right? When you look at a tree, you probably are like, that's a beautiful trunk. No, nobody says that. But they will say, oh my gosh, look at the beautiful branches. Look at the way those leaves are huge and colorful, right? So it's most visible, and they branch out, they communicate with each other very much like we do as people. And sometimes the message is good and nice and kind, and sometimes the message is harmful, aggressive, evil, and nasty, right? But how do we want our trees to blossom? And that's not to imply that people that hold conservative views are evil by any sense of the meaning. Again, this is literally just what the research is implying. But it does lead us to question, would those that are taking extreme approaches when they feel violated based on their views, such as attacking federal places or verbally and physically assaulting people in Home Depot? There's another video, I didn't pull that one, but there was quite a riot in a Home Depot over a mask one time. I mean, people got spitting, it was really nasty. You catch a lot of hands then. But nonetheless, that just leaves me leaving you with questions on Like, what does your branches say to the world? What does your branches communicate to others regarding your views, your foundations, your values, your roots, and how you are on this earth? Thank you so much for attending. Questions, feel free to ask or email me. I've also provided links to all of my socials, LinkedIn, ResearchGate, and my Facebook research page, Take a Chance Lab. I think we have some time for questions. Yeah, we have some time for questions if anyone has questions. Yes.
A little more theoretical. How much does your research depend upon moral foundations theory? Do you think you could maintain much of what you're doing if there was a substantial criticism of the law?
Not as much, because that's the theory that's most heavily supported by the data, and that is the one that's the theory as opposed to the hypotheses. I feel like the benefit of the moral foundations theory is that it's so significantly validated between so many different disciplines. I wasn't even concerned that that wasn't going to be something that stands. And again, I'm from North Carolina. I'm from the rural South. I grew up in the Bible Belt, and so heavily knowing that people are not going to just shake their morality or things is going to always influence behavior.
I don't mean the moral foundation. I mean NFT as created by hate and
yes.
That there are criticisms, the question about the longitudinal studies that show the effect actually can go the other way. And instead of being able to predict people's political ideologies from their moral views, you can do it the other way, maybe even better.
Right.
So that it doesn't play the role that hate tries to claim it has, that there are criticisms that it has a conservative bias in the selection of the criteria. That is, there are other moral theories, that are more neutral in that sense. And you can look at communism or even utilitarianism that doesn't have the sort of maybe political view that theirs might have implicit in it. What I'm wondering is, would your research still hold up? In other words, could you say, well, I could jettison that, and I still have something worthwhile here? Or is it that truly?
Personally, I'm going to say yes, because again, people provide their responses on these dichotomous, variables. Again, these semantics, the labeling of them, a rose by any other name is still a rose, right? If the views that are held in these categories would still be oppressing on the rights of others, then it's still, maybe I don't call it oppression, I can call it something else, but it still is what it is, if that makes sense. So even without the labeling of the moral foundations theory, I personally feel like it would stand. And to speak to the other component that you said about the bias as far as being more liberal, there's actually a whole section in this paper that talks about the fact that social scientists by nature tend to be far more liberal and progressive in their views. And I really highlight that and make people aware of that. I also have a positionality statement that speaks to the fact that me as a Black woman in America, I also exist in this place where I know that my own personal views can influence that, can have bias on that. However, doing everything we can to, from a qualitative standpoint, we bracket out these, or at least make people aware that this is a factor. It shouldn't overshadow or shade the results that were quite evident in over 1,700 people's views, if that makes sense. Any other questions? And did that speak to what your question
the
was?
The only thing is that, it's actually, hate's been criticized for MFT having a conservative bias.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're saying was that your research did everything to avoid any influence that might have had any.
And very mindful to not do so in the sense where it feels like it attacks people that hold conservative views. Because I do know conservative people that don't necessarily feel like there would be any potential harm, or that you're going to go steal my yard sign. I don't have a yard sign, but if I did, I wouldn't feel like you'd go burn it in my yard or something like that. But it also causes people to still questions like, would you stand up for me if it came down to someone saying I was potentially harmed? Would you hold a view such as just world fallacy, where I feel like if you got everything you deserve based on the way life landed for you, right? And again, conservative biases are held against people that hold those views in a way that paints them almost in an unfavorabilistic light. And so just trying to use the language without heavily padding it is what I was trying to go for there. And to support that, I do have a whole secondary component. As I said, I did the quantitative analysis, but then I had a secondary scale that I said, if you want to provide some responses as far as to why you feel that way, click this link and follow it to the second. So I have pages and pages of qualitative why answers that now needs to be analyzed and published that might allude and highlight some of those factors, right? So to give us more insight.
I was wondering your thoughts on belief in a just world. You mentioned it just now. So the literature says like belief in a just world theory is like what you get what you earn. Like
Right, like
karma.
everything is gonna be fair because if something bad happened to you,
Yeah.
you had that coming to you for some extent.
But there's also like authorities are good in belief in a just world, right? So
Yes.
like you believe in systems that are fair and whatever. And there's a strong correlation between conservative ideology and belief in a just world. I'm really interested in like new Trump conservatism, which clearly shows anti-authoritarian or anti-institutional sentiments.
Right.
Not so supportive of institutions of authority as much as maybe older modern conservatism. So I was wondering what your thoughts were, maybe if you saw that in the literature at all, if there's a distinction between maybe new age Trump conservatism versus older modern conservatism with regards to belief in a just world.
I think that really falls heavily into the idea of generational divides because what we found through looking at generational differences that the support and belief in government was like heavily, of course, in the boomer generation. Like, yeah, the government's here, they're going to protect us, they're going to do what they do. Gen Z started really questioning that. I think millennials were like, you don't care nothing about the government. Gen Z and Gen Alpha, I'm quite curious to see where that's going to go, especially with Gen Z's oldest group now finally hitting that age of emerging adulthood. We're seeing that there's really that apathy kind of brewing, for lack of better words, but having to be reminded that there's still value in democracy, and I say that with air quotes because it's like someone asked me, is it true democracy or is it just the lack of anything else that's not democracy? And I was like, maybe that's what it is, but it's what we have, right? So I'm hoping that some of that might get lighted up when I also look at those qualitative remarks to see some of those whys that are supporting these whats that I have found here. Any other questions? Question?
A few weeks ago, I attended the leadership training by Kansas Leadership Center.
Yeah.
And during the training, there was a comment that they said, the instructor said, during a conflict, people will choose loyalty over values.
Yes.
It hit me hard. It haunted me till today. So I'm so excited about your presentation today. So as a social psychologist, what's your view on that comment that people always tend to choose loyalty over their values?
I think for me, growing up the way I did personally, I see that heavily in how we align ourselves with people and that we're really going to be with someone that, for lack of better words, they ride for us. And that's that sense of loyalty that we call. They might deviate a little bit. And here's an example of what you said. So again, I'm from Fayetteville, North Carolina, and this is near what we call, it was Fort Bragg, now it's called Fort Liberty, by changing names. However, it's the second biggest military branch in the United States, biggest on the East Coast. And so talking to past family members of military, friends, they would tell me interesting stories about, especially their experiences in the field, overseas, and how they built some friendships with some of their past battlemates, right? And I would ask, well, y'all are so different. I've literally heard this person use a derogatory slang. And he said, well, that's my brother. He would do anything for me, and I would do anything for him. I was like, but you don't like black people. You didn't know that, right? You just said the N-word. And he's like, he would protect me if someone came at me, came at my neck. And it just baffled me. I'm like, what? How? I think situations can trump dispositions, which kind of really speaks to that fact of loyalty. If you've been put in a place where your back was up against the wall and there was no one else there, if you found true, authentic, like unwavering support, then you lean into that and you push into that, which is how we find family and people that aren't necessarily kin, right?
And also, in terms of loyalty, I was also thinking about the party line.
So
People always vote for the party instead of making judgments.
Right, informed
instead of
decisions.
using their common sense to vote for their values.
And we're hearing that sometimes with people that are jumping ship, for lack of better words, or voting outside of their party alignment because it didn't align particularly with how they feel, or I'm not voting for me, I'm voting for my grandkids, right, or my nieces and nephews. So we're seeing vocal shifts in that. Some people are vocal and they speak up about it. Some people are like, they're going to tuck it away. They'll never say anything. but we know it exists. We see the numbers where it exists, right? Pew Research Center feel like they're throwing something out every week that's indicating somebody's not doing what they're saying they're doing. There's a misalignment in your words and your actions. And, you know, shouts out to Elliot Aronson and his research on cognitive dissonance. I don't know how people can exist in that place of doing one thing and saying another, or saying one thing and doing another. That's really hard to maintain, but it happens.
Thank you.
Yes. Any other questions, thoughts? Yes.
Oh, well, I'm just gonna close up.
Okay.
Okay.
Here you go. Thank you all.